The fortress wall is burning, not from cannon fire, from something else, something that clings to stone and flesh alike, that transforms defenders into chemists and civilians into weapon makers. In the autumn of 1552, a small Hungarian garrison fought the Ottoman Empire, using methods so disturbing that both sides would later pretend they never happened. This is not the heroic story you learned in school. This is the story they buried beneath the smoke. What you're about to hear contains descriptions of improvised weapons, chemical warfare, and desperate acts that challenge our understanding of Renaissance siege defense. The evidence exists in fragments, contradictions, and deliberate omissions. The truth was written in smoke and fire, then erased by those who survived it. This is the Siege of Eger. And history has been lying about it for centuries. To understand why the defenders of Eger turned to forbidden methods, you need to understand that they were never supposed to win. They weren't even supposed to survive the first week. Every strategic calculation, every political decision, every military assessment pointed to the same inevitable conclusion. Eger would fall, and everyone inside it would die. The year is 1552. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent has spent decades expanding into Central Europe, conquering fortress after fortress, pushing deeper into Christian territory with methodical efficiency. Hungary is caught in a brutal vice, split between Habsburg Austria to the west and the Ottoman juggernaut to the east. The country is bleeding from 1,000 cuts, divided politically, militarily exhausted, watching its fortresses crumble one by one. Eger sits in northern Hungary, far from the main Ottoman supply lines, but strategically positioned to control the northern approaches to Buda and the Hungarian heartland. It's not a massive fortress. The walls are thick stone, yes, but they were built for medieval warfare, not for the age of gunpowder. The garrison is small, somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 defenders, depending on which source you believe. Among them are professional soldiers, local militia, armed craftsmen, and a population of civilians who have nowhere else to go. The fortress commander is István Dobó, a Hungarian nobleman who understands military tactics but has never faced anything like what's coming. He's been pleading with the Habsburg court for months, sending letter after letter requesting reinforcements, supplies, additional artillery. The responses are diplomatic delays and empty promises. The Habsburg Empire is fighting wars on multiple fronts. Eger is expendable. Inside the fortress, the mood is grim. Soldiers are rationing food before the siege even begins. Blacksmiths are working overtime to forge weapons, repair armor, create makeshift defenses. Women and children are being organized into supply chains, water brigades, repair crews. Everyone understands what's happening. The Ottoman army is gathering. Intelligence reports describe a force so large that it will take hours just to march past a single point on the road. The civilian population is approximately 4,000 souls, families who have lived in and around Eger for generations. Merchants who have stockpiled their goods in underground storage. Priests who are conducting daily prayers for salvation that most people know won't come. Children are being taught to recognize different types of cannon fire so they'll know when to take shelter. Old women are writing letters to relatives they'll never see again, sealing them with wax and hiding them in walls, hoping someone will find them after the fortress falls. The defenders have maybe 6 weeks of food if they ration carefully. They have limited gunpowder, their cannons are outdated, their walls have weak points that any competent siege engineer will identify within hours. They have no guarantee of relief forces arriving. They have no backup plan. They have no escape route. What they do have is time to prepare improvised defenses. And in those preparations, in the desperate weeks before the Ottoman army arrives, something shifts in the fortress's collective psychology. The defenders begin experimenting with weapons that exist in a gray area between conventional siege defense and something darker. They begin asking questions that professional soldiers don't usually ask. What burns hotter than oil? What creates smoke thick enough to blind dozens of men at once? What substances cause the most pain when they make contact with exposed skin? The historical record from this period is frustratingly vague. Hungarian chroniclers later writing about the siege tend to skip over certain details or describe them in sanitized language. Ottoman accounts exist, but many have been lost or were never widely distributed. What we're left with are fragments, hints, implications buried in letters and administrative documents that only make sense when you read between the lines. One document from late summer 1552 mentions shipments of sulfur arriving at the fortress, not a small amount for gunpowder production, a large amount. Another document references lime being purchased in quantities that don't match any construction project. A third mentions specialized cauldrons being forged, larger than the cooking vessels, with reinforced handles designed to be carried by multiple people while filled with boiling liquid. The defenders are preparing something. They're stockpiling materials, they're running tests, and they're doing it quietly, without official documentation, without leaving a clear paper trail. In late September, scouts bring confirmation. The Ottoman army is 3 days away. The force is massive. Perhaps 35,000 soldiers, possibly more. They're bringing siege towers, heavy artillery, specialized assault troops. Sultan Suleiman has assigned experienced commanders who have conquered fortresses across 2 continents. This isn't a probing raid, this is an extermination. Dobal gathers his officers. The meeting is closed door. No records survive of what was discussed, but we know the outcome. The defenders will hold the walls using any method available. Any method. There are no prohibited tactics when you're facing certain death. On September 29, 1552, the Ottoman army arrives at Eger. The defenders watch from the walls as the horizon fills with soldiers, tents, siege equipment, supply wagons stretching for miles. The Ottomans establish their siege lines with professional efficiency. Engineers begin surveying the walls, identifying weak points, calculating firing angles. Within hours, the siege trenches are being dug, bringing attackers closer under cover. The civilian population retreats into basements and interior buildings. Children are forbidden from going near the walls. Women begin organizing the first shifts of supply runners. The blacksmiths light their forges. The cauldrons are filled with water and set over massive fires. And in secured rooms away from prying eyes, defenders begin mixing substances according to recipes that were never written down. Formulas passed by whispered conversation. Experimental alchemy driven by desperation. If you're enjoying this investigation into forgotten history, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more videos like this. The first Ottoman cannon fires at dawn on October 2nd. The sound echoes across the valley, a thunderclap that shakes the fortress foundations. The stone ball weighs hundreds of pounds. It travels in a high arc, visible for a fraction of a second, then impacts the outer wall with a concussion that defenders feel through their boots 50 meters away. The wall cracks but doesn't collapse. Not yet. Over the next hour, 15 more cannons open fire. The bombardment establishes a rhythm that will continue for weeks. Every few minutes, another impact. Stone dust fills the air. Defenders crouch behind parapets, covering their ears, waiting for the barrage to pause. When it does, they emerge to assess damage, shore up crumbling sections, pull wounded men back from exposed positions. The Ottoman siege is methodical, professional, overwhelming. They're not rushing. They don't need to. They have the numbers, the supplies, the experience. They can afford to pound the walls day after day, wearing down the defenders' morale as much as their fortifications. They can afford casualties. The defenders cannot. Within the first week, the psychological toll becomes visible. Soldiers flinch at sounds. Civilians develop nervous tics, constantly scanning the sky for incoming projectiles. Children stop playing. The constant bombardment doesn't allow for normal sleep patterns. People catch rest in 15-minute intervals between barrages, then snap awake when the next impact hits. Exhaustion compounds terror, compounds desperation. The Ottomans probe the defenses with small assault teams. They're testing response times, looking for weak sections, forcing the defenders to spread thin. These aren't serious attempts to breach the walls yet. They're reconnaissance by combat, and they're effective. The defenders lose men to arrows, to musket fire, to accidents and exhaustion. Every casualty reduces the available manpower. Every loss makes the next defense harder. By mid-October, the first disturbing defensive methods appear. The historical sources become deliberately vague here, but multiple accounts reference unexpected fires during Ottoman assaults. Turkish soldiers retreat reporting burns that don't match normal fire damage. Hungarian sources mention special preparations being deployed from the walls. Here's what we can piece together from fragmentary evidence. Defenders prepare clay pots filled with a mixture that includes quicklime, sulfur, pitch, and possibly saltpeter. The mixture isn't quite Greek fire, it's not quite gunpowder, it's something improvised, experimental, and when thrown from walls or poured down at climbing soldiers, it creates effects that contemporary accounts struggle to describe. One Ottoman diary fragment mentions soldiers with chemical burns that resisted treatment. Another describes a smell that made men vomit. The defenders also employ boiling oil, which is well documented in medieval siege defense. But they're not just using oil. They're experimenting with sand heated in metal containers until it's nearly white hot, then poured on attackers. Burning sand behaves differently than burning liquid. It embeds in fabric, works its way into armor joints, sticks to exposed skin. It can't be easily brushed away. Women play a crucial role in these defensive innovations. And this is where the historical record becomes particularly sanitized. Later, patriotic narratives describe women heroically supporting their men, carrying supplies, tending the wounded. That happened, yes. But there's evidence of something more disturbing. Women weren't just supporting the defense. They were inventing new methods of inflicting casualties. One account from a Franciscan friar who survived the siege mentions women mixing devil's recipes in secured courtyard areas. Another reference describes female civilians operating the large cauldrons, maintaining temperatures, preparing substances that soldiers would then deploy. A third source, a letter from a survivor written decades later, mentions women who knew the art of burning water, a phrase that suggests either advanced chemistry knowledge or desperate experimentation, producing accidental discoveries. The defenders are transforming the fortress into a chemical weapons laboratory. They're working without reference books, without trained alchemists, without safety protocols. They're mixing substances based on folk knowledge, trial and error, and whatever creates the most horrific results when deployed against attackers. People are getting burned in their own fortress from handling these materials. The historical record hints at internal casualties, accidents, exposure to toxic fumes. The Ottomans adapt. They begin using longer ladders to avoid the effective range of poured substances. They deploy more archers to suppress defenders on the walls. They accelerate the bombardment, creating breaches that will allow mass assaults rather than climbing attacks. The siege is escalating on both sides. By late October, the fortress walls have multiple damaged sections. Food supplies are dwindling faster than expected. Water is being rationed. Disease is spreading through the cramped, unsanitary conditions inside the fortress. Defenders are collapsing from exhaustion, infections, psychological breakdown. The Ottoman noose is tightening, and then the defenders deploy their most controversial weapon. Multiple sources reference an incident in late October where Ottoman assault troops attempting to exploit a wall breach encountered suffocating smoke that caused mass casualties. The smoke wasn't normal. It wasn't from burning wood or oil fires. Survivors described it as thick, yellow-green, impossible to see through, burning their lungs and eyes. Men staggered back from the breach, coughing blood, temporarily blinded, unable to breathe properly for days afterward. What was in that smoke? We don't know precisely. The defenders left no recipe. Ottoman commanders never formally investigated. But chemical historians have proposed several possibilities based on the described symptoms and available materials. One theory suggests a mixture of sulfur, pitch, and dried plant materials soaked in saltpeter solution, then burned in confined spaces near breaches. The combustion would produce sulfur dioxide, a toxic gas that causes exactly the respiratory symptoms described in survivor accounts. Another theory points to quicklime dust dispersed in enclosed areas. When lime contacts moisture, sweat, breath, tears, it generates heat and caustic burns. Ottoman soldiers pushing through a breach filled with lime dust would experience burning sensations in their lungs, temporary blindness, and skin irritation. A third possibility involves early smoke bombs using a combination of pitch, sulfur, and animal fat, creating thick smoke that's deliberately toxic rather than just obscuring. Medieval and Renaissance alchemists knew certain combinations produce fumes that made people sick. The defenders may have weaponized folk chemistry knowledge. The disturbing implication: the defenders of Eger may have deployed crude chemical weapons, not sophisticated nerve agents, not modern warfare, but improvised toxic substances deliberately designed to incapacitate and kill through respiratory damage and chemical burns. And, if that's accurate, it represents one of the earliest documented uses of chemical warfare in European history. The historical establishment has been uncomfortable with this possibility for centuries. Hungarian national mythology portrays the siege as a heroic defensive victory through courage and faith. Admitting the defenders used protochemical weapons complicates that narrative. Ottoman sources that might provide corroboration are scarce, and the ones that exist were often suppressed because they portrayed the empire's elite troops being defeated by methods they considered dishonorable. But the evidence exists in fragments, letters mentioning unnatural smoke, medical accounts of unusual lung ailments in Ottoman survivors, references to Greek tricks and poisoned air in Turkish military reports. The pieces are there if you're willing to assemble them into an uncomfortable picture. The defenders of Eger were dying. They were watching their children starve. They were facing an enemy with overwhelming numbers and superior artillery. And when you're in that position, when surrender means execution or slavery, when fighting conventionally means certain defeat, you start asking different questions. You start mixing different substances. You start deploying methods that professional soldiers would refuse. The fortress was becoming something darker than a military installation. It was becoming a laboratory of desperation. By early November, the siege has entered its 5th week. The fortress walls are crumbling in multiple sections. The Ottoman bombardment has created 3 major breaches and dozens of smaller damage points. Food supplies are critically low. Disease is spreading rapidly through the overcrowded fortress interior. Defenders are sleeping 3 hours per night in rotating shifts. The human mind begins to break under these conditions. Soldiers report hallucinations. Civilians are found wandering in shock. Children have stopped crying, which is more disturbing than their earlier terror. The Ottoman command is preparing a major assault. They've identified the weakest breach, assembled elite Janissary troops, coordinated artillery support. This will be the decisive push. Once their shock troops are inside the fortress, the defense will collapse within hours. Everyone knows this. The defenders, the attackers, the civilians huddled in basements, writing final letters to families they'll never reach. And this is where the historical record fractures into contradictory accounts that have puzzled historians for centuries. What happened during the November assault attempts doesn't follow normal siege warfare patterns. The accounts don't match. Both sides later tried to explain it with different narratives, and buried in those contradictions is something deeply unsettling. The Ottoman assault begins at dawn on November 4th. Janissaries advance toward the primary breach under covering fire from archers and musketeers. The defenders respond with conventional fire from remaining cannons and small arms. For the first 20 minutes, this is normal siege combat, casualties on both sides, steady Ottoman progress toward the breach, defenders preparing for hand-to-hand fighting once the attackers reach the walls. Then something happens that multiple sources describe, but none explain satisfactorily. A Hungarian chronicle states, the enemy was driven back by fires that clung to them and smoke that blinded all who breathed it. An Ottoman military report mentions, unusual combustions caused our advanced troops to retreat. The nature of these fires is unclear. A letter from a survivor describes, God delivered us through flames that burned without natural fuel and air that choked our enemies while sparing the faithful. A Venetian intelligence report, written weeks later based on merchant testimony, references chemical arts unknown to contemporary warfare. What actually happened? Let's examine the physical evidence and try to reconstruct events from multiple perspectives. From the Ottoman viewpoint, elite troops are advancing toward a breach in disciplined formation. They've done this dozens of times at other fortresses. They know the risks. They're trained to handle defenders throwing stones, pouring oil, shooting arrows. They're prepared for conventional resistance. As they approach the breach, defenders on the walls above begin pouring substances down. This is expected. Ottoman soldiers raise shields, protect their heads, continue advancing. But the liquid isn't behaving like oil. It's thicker. It's clinging to armor in ways that burning oil doesn't. And when it ignites, not from contact with the heated liquid, but from secondary ignition sources the defenders are throwing, it burns with intense heat that armor doesn't adequately protect against. Simultaneously, the breach itself is filling with smoke, not normal smoke from fires. This smoke is dense, yellow-tinted, moves against the wind. It pours out of the breach like water flowing uphill. Ottoman soldiers entering the breach start coughing immediately. Within seconds, they're gasping, unable to breathe properly. Their eyes are burning. Visibility drops to arm's length. Men are colliding with each other, disoriented, trying to retreat but unable to see the exit. Officers behind the assault force are shouting orders, trying to understand what's happening. They can see the smoke. They can hear their elite troops choking and screaming, but they can't see into the breach. They don't know if the defenders have opened some kind of volcanic vent, if this is a natural gas release, if this is sorcery, or if this is weaponized chemistry. The assault collapses. Janissaries retreat in disorder. Some dragging comrades who've collapsed from respiratory distress. Medical personnel treat burns that don't match fire damage. Chemical burns that continue damaging tissue hours after exposure. Lung ailments that persist for days, leaving soldiers coughing blood and unable to march. The Ottoman commanders order a pause to reassess. This isn't normal defensive fire. This is something they haven't encountered before. Inside the fortress, the defenders are experiencing their own crisis. The chemical mixtures they've deployed are affecting their own people. Soldiers who prepared the materials have blistered hands. Civilians who carried containers have respiratory problems from fume exposure. There are burns, accidents, internal casualties from handling substances without proper protection or understanding. And there's a moral reckoning happening. The defenders aren't professional chemists engaging in calculated warfare. They're ordinary people, craftsmen, farmers, minor nobility, who have been pushed to methods that disturb them. Contemporary letters hint at religious debates within the fortress. Is using these weapons a sin? Is desperation a justification? Are they fighting holy defense or engaging in devil's work? The historical sources avoid these questions. Later narratives sanitize the entire episode, but the psychological weight must have been immense. You've transformed your home into a poison factory. You've deployed weapons that cause suffering beyond what swords and arrows achieve. You've watched enemy soldiers writhe and choke, and you know you might have to do it again. The Ottomans try a different approach. They shift their assault to a section of wall that hasn't been chemically trapped. They advance at night when smoke disperses more easily. They use longer scaling equipment that keeps troops away from pouring range. The defenders adapt. They prepare new positions. They experiment with different mixtures. There's evidence they tried to create directional smoke, funneling toxic fumes toward specific attack routes. They built enclosed areas near breaches that could be rapidly filled with caustic smoke, transforming defensive positions into chemical kill zones. One particularly disturbing account comes from a priest's diary discovered in the 20th century. He describes women mixing 7 types of fire, testing different ratios, adjusting recipes based on which produce the most effective results. He mentions children being evacuated from areas where mixing was occurring because the fumes were causing illness. He references a meeting where Dobo, the fortress commander, expressed concern about the long-term health effects on defenders, but concluded they had no choice. This is not romantic heroic defense. This is desperate experimentation with dangerous substances by people with limited understanding of chemistry, creating weapons that harm attackers and defenders alike, driven by the knowledge that surrender means death. By mid-November, the siege has become a horror show for both sides. Ottomans are facing an enemy that deploys what they perceive as dishonored, possibly demonic methods. Defenders are physically and psychologically breaking from the strain of constant combat, chemical exposure, and moral weight of their tactics. Civilians are dying from disease, starvation, and accidents. The fortress is a charnel house filled with toxic smoke and desperation. And then something happens that neither side anticipated, something that would determine the siege's outcome, but remain shrouded in contradictory explanations for centuries. On November 17th, the Ottomans launch what should be their final, overwhelming assault. Multiple breach points attacked simultaneously. Thousands of soldiers committed. Artillery barrage intensified to suppress defender response. This is the decisive moment. The fortress will fall today, or the siege will fail. The assault begins with horrific intensity. Hand-to-hand combat in the breaches. Defenders and attackers locked in brutal close quarters fighting. Smoke and fire obscuring everything. Screaming, metal on metal. The smell of burning flesh and sulfur. For hours, the outcome is uncertain. Ottoman troops are inside the fortress in several places. Defenders are fighting desperately to contain the penetrations. Then the contradictions begin. Ottoman sources report that their troops encountered hellish fires and poisoned air that forced retreat despite tactical advantages. Some accounts mention a mysterious explosion that caused casualties and psychological panic. Others reference divine intervention preventing Muslim victory. Hungarian sources describe miraculous deliverance through faith and courage. They downplay chemical defenses, emphasizing hand-to-hand heroism. Some mention a gunpowder storage accident that coincidentally occurred during the Ottoman assault, creating smoke and fire that accidentally aided the defense. A third set of sources, mostly Venetian and German intelligence reports compiled from merchant testimony, suggests something more complex, that the defenders deliberately triggered some kind of chemical explosion or massive smoke deployment that filled multiple breach areas simultaneously, creating conditions so toxic that Ottoman troops couldn't maintain their positions despite having numerical advantage. The truth is probably a combination. The defenders likely deployed their most aggressive chemical weapons, possibly including substances they'd been saving for this exact scenario. There may have been an accidental explosion that compounded the deliberate chemical releases. Ottoman troops, already demoralized by weeks of unconventional warfare, may have reached a psychological breaking point when faced with conditions that military training hadn't prepared them for. What we know for certain, the Ottoman assault failed. Elite troops retreated. Casualties were high on both sides, but the psychological impact on the attackers was greater. And crucially, the Ottoman command made the decision that the fortress wasn't worth the cost of continuing. This is where the siege enters its final, strangest phase. The Ottoman withdrawal doesn't happen immediately. It unfolds over several days in late November. A slow realization among the besieging army that this fortress has cost too much in blood, morale, and time. The decision isn't purely military. It's psychological, political, and deeply uncomfortable for an empire that views retreat as unthinkable. On November 18th, the day after the failed final assault, Ottoman commanders hold a council. No official record exists, but subsequent actions reveal their thinking. Continue the siege into winter with a demoralized army facing defenders who employed disturbing weapons. Or withdraw and explain to Sultan Suleiman why elite troops couldn't conquer a small Hungarian fortress. The answer isn't simple. The Ottomans have suffered higher casualties than expected. Possibly 3,000 dead, many more wounded or incapacitated by respiratory ailments. They've faced weapons that violate their understanding of honorable warfare. They're dealing with supply line problems, onset of winter weather, and disease spreading through the siege camp. Most critically, they're dealing with soldiers who no longer want to assault the walls. Ottoman military culture emphasizes courage, discipline, and faith in Allah's will. But there's a difference between facing swords and arrows with courage and facing choking smoke and burning chemicals that cling to your skin. The Janissaries, supposedly the Sultan's most elite troops, have been repelled by a garrison they outnumber 15-1. The psychological damage is worse than the physical casualties. Weather contributes to the decision. Late November brings cold rain that turns siege trenches into mud rivers. Disease accelerates in these conditions. Ottoman supply wagons are struggling on deteriorating roads. Winter campaigning this far north is logistically nightmarish. Textbook military wisdom says, don't besiege a fortress in winter unless you can starve them out. And Eger has proven it can't be starved quickly. But there's another factor that Ottoman sources hint at obliquely. Something about the siege disturbed the command staff on a moral or religious level. References to unclean methods appear in several documents. One letter mentions concerns that the weapons used by defenders might be against the laws of war as understood by civilized peoples. Another suggests some commanders believed the smoke and fires were demonic, that continuing would invite divine punishment. The Ottoman Empire wasn't naive about warfare. They'd employed sophisticated tactics, cunning strategies, and ruthless methods across 2 continents. But this siege crossed lines they hadn't anticipated crossing. The defenders weren't fighting by rules the Ottomans recognized. On November 21st, Ottoman artillery ceases firing. Troops begin withdrawing from advanced positions. Siege equipment is dismantled. By November 24th, the main Ottoman force is marching away, leaving only a token rearguard to monitor the fortress. Inside Eger, the defenders don't trust it. They maintain full defensive readiness for 3 more days, expecting the withdrawal to be a trick. Only when scouts confirm the Ottoman camps are truly abandoned do they begin to believe they've survived. The celebration is muted. There's relief, yes, prayers of thanksgiving. But there's no triumphant joy. The fortress is devastated. Walls are broken in a dozen places. Every building has damage. The civilian death toll is approximately 800, 20% of the population. Hundreds more are injured, sick, or disabled. The survivors are traumatized in ways that contemporary psychology can't name or treat. Soldiers are experiencing what modern medicine would call PTSD, hypervigilance, flashbacks, inability to sleep without reliving combat. Civilians have watched neighbors die horrible deaths, have participated in making and deploying chemical weapons, have done things that will haunt them forever. The physical devastation is visible. The psychological devastation is hidden but profound. Women who mix the chemical compounds have respiratory damage that will shorten their lives. Children who witness the worst fighting develop behavioral problems that persist for years. Men who fought in the breaches drink themselves into oblivion, trying to forget what they saw and did. And there's a conspiracy of silence beginning. The fortress leadership recognizes that what happened during the siege needs to be managed carefully. The weapons they deployed are troubling. The methods they used are disturbing. The full truth would raise uncomfortable questions about Christian defenders using what could be characterized as dishonorable or even demonic tactics. Istvan Dobo, the fortress commander, begins controlling the narrative immediately. In his official reports to Habsburg authorities, he emphasizes conventional heroic defense, faith, courage, determination. He mentions fire weapons but doesn't elaborate. He credits divine intervention. He praises the defenders' valor. He doesn't mention the chemical experiments, the suffocating smoke, the caustic compounds that burned Ottoman flesh. The Habsburg court is relieved by the victory, but not particularly interested in details. Eger was never a priority fortress. Its survival is a pleasant surprise, but doesn't change the larger strategic situation. They file Dobo's reports and move on to more pressing concerns. The Ottoman Empire faces a different problem. Elite troops failed to conquer a small fortress. This is embarrassing. The official explanations blame weather, disease, logistical problems, and divine will. They mention the defenders' fierce resistance. They don't detail the specific weapons that drove their troops back. They certainly don't admit that Janissaries retreated from smoke and chemical burns. The Ottoman military culture involves honor, reputation, martial prowess. Admitting defeat to unusual weapons undermines the entire imperial image. Better to frame it as a tactical withdrawal due to weather and supply issues. Better to bury the uncomfortable details. So both sides have incentive to sanitize the story. Both sides begin constructing preferred narratives that downplay the most disturbing elements. And over the next several decades, those sanitized versions become the official history. But the survivors know. The people who mixed the chemicals, who breathed the smoke, who saw what those weapons did to human bodies, they know. And some of them write about it years later in fragmentary letters and diary entries that weren't meant for publication. One letter from 1567, written by a survivor to his nephew, mentions, "We did things at Eger that I pray you never need to do. The victory came at a price to our souls as well as our bodies. I cannot describe the methods we used. I sometimes wake believing I can still smell the sulfur, still hear the men choking. Perhaps God will forgive us. We had no choice. But that knowledge doesn't ease the memory." Another account from a woman who survived the siege references, "I learned to make 7 types of fire, each more terrible than the last. I carried pots of burning sand up ladder steps. I watched what happened when those substances touched human skin. The priests told us we were defending Christendom. They didn't tell us what defending Christendom would require us to become." These personal accounts reveal the psychological cost. The defenders won, yes. They saved the fortress, yes. They prevented Ottoman expansion into northern Hungary, yes. But they did it using methods that disturbed them, that gave them nightmares, that forced them to question their own humanity. The siege also creates a precedent that military historians quietly note, but rarely emphasize. Desperate defenders with limited resources can create improvised weapons that defeat superior conventional forces. The methods used at Eger will reappear in various forms in later sieges. Chemical warfare, in crude forms, becomes part of the European military toolkit. The lesson is learned even if the specific details are buried. By December 1552, Eger is nominally victorious but practically destroyed. The fortress needs complete rebuilding. The population needs food, medicine, psychological recovery. Habsburg authorities provide limited support, some supplies, some money, some recognition of the achievement. But Eger is left largely to rebuild itself. Over the next decade, the fortress is slowly reconstructed. Walls are repaired, buildings are rebuilt. New settlers arrive to replace the dead. The survivors gradually age and die, taking their detailed memories with them. Children grow up hearing heroic stories that omit the darkest details. The uncomfortable truth dissolves into legend, and the legend begins to replace reality. Within 20 years of the siege, the first mythologized accounts begin appearing. Poets write verses celebrating Eger's heroic defense. Artists paint dramatic scenes of defenders courageously repelling vast Ottoman hordes. Religious authorities frame the victory as divine intervention rewarding Christian faith. The siege becomes a symbol of Hungarian resistance, a rallying point for national identity. And in that transformation from event to symbol, the disturbing details disappear. The chemical weapons become fire weapons, vague enough to sound dramatic without being specific. The suffocating smoke becomes defensive fires. The caustic compounds that burn skin become boiling oil, which is traditional and acceptable in siege warfare narratives. The women who mix dangerous substances become heroic supporters, bringing water to soldiers. The children who witnessed horror become innocent symbols of what was being defended. This isn't deliberate conspiracy. It's organic narrative evolution driven by political, cultural, and psychological needs. Societies need heroes. National identities require inspiring stories. Religious institutions want examples of faith rewarded. Nobody benefits from emphasizing that defenders used proto-chemical weapons, that civilians became chemists mixing toxic compounds, that the victory involved methods that made participants psychologically sick. The historical sources themselves reflect this sanitization process. Compare accounts written in 1552, 1553, with accounts written in 1580s, 1600. Early accounts mention unusual fires, suffocating smokes, substances that burned unlike normal flames, methods that disturb both sides. These are primary sources, often letters or administrative documents not intended for wide distribution. Later accounts describe heroic resistance, clever defensive tactics, faith and courage, divine protection. These are official chronicles, patriotic literature, church histories, documents designed to inspire and instruct. The transformation is systematic. Every disturbing detail is either removed, softened, or reframed as conventional warfare. By the mid-17th century, the Siege of Eger has become a patriotic fable with minimal resemblance to the actual events. The Ottoman Empire undergoes a parallel process. Turkish military historians mention Eger briefly, usually explaining it as a tactical withdrawal due to weather and logistics. They don't dwell on the defeat. They certainly don't describe the weapons that drove their troops back. The siege becomes a footnote, an anomaly in an otherwise triumphant narrative of Ottoman expansion. European observers outside Hungary and Turkey have their own interpretations. Venetian intelligence, always interested in Ottoman military capabilities, collects the most accurate information but doesn't widely publicize it. German chronicles mention the siege but focus on Habsburg politics. Polish sources note it as a regional event. Nobody except Hungarians has strong incentive to investigate the full truth, and so the truth fragments. Pieces survive in scattered documents: a letter in a monastery archive, an administrative record in Vienna, a medical report in Istanbul. But these pieces aren't assembled into a complete picture. They exist separately, unconnected, waiting for historians centuries later to recognize their significance. The 20th century brings renewed historical interest in the siege. Hungarian historians, particularly during periods of nationalism, celebrate Eger as a supreme example of national heroism. They excavate the fortress, study remaining fortifications, analyze casualty estimates. But they largely accept the sanitized narrative. The disturbing weapons are mentioned as innovative defensive tactics without detailed examination. It's not until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that revisionist historians begin asking uncomfortable questions. What exactly were these fire weapons? What caused the symptoms Ottoman survivors described? Why do contemporary accounts mention sulfur and lime in quantities that don't match gunpowder production? Why are there gaps in the documentary record around specific defensive methods? Chemical warfare historians notice Eger. They recognize the symptom descriptions match sulfur dioxide exposure, quicklime burns, and other effects consistent with toxic compound deployment. They point out that the materials required for crude chemical weapons were available in 16th century Hungary. They suggest the siege represents an early example of chemical warfare in European history. This interpretation is controversial. Hungarian patriotic narratives resist it. The national identity investment in Eger as heroic defense doesn't accommodate discussions of chemical weapons. Academic debates become heated. Historians accuse each other of either sanitizing violence or sensationalizing warfare. The truth remains contested, but the evidence, when assembled comprehensively, points to a conclusion many find uncomfortable. The defenders of Eger used improvised toxic substances against Ottoman attackers. These weren't sophisticated modern chemical weapons, but they were deliberately deployed compounds designed to incapacitate and kill through respiratory damage and chemical burns. The defenders knew these substances were dangerous. They used them anyway, and both sides subsequently tried to bury that knowledge. Why does this matter 5 centuries later? Because it reveals how societies construct comfortable histories from uncomfortable realities. The Siege of Eger actually happened. Real people mixed sulfur and lime. Real soldiers choked on toxic smoke. Real civilians participated in creating weapons that disturbed them. Real commanders made decisions to deploy methods they knew would haunt survivors. And within decades, all of that reality was smoothed into an inspirational fable about faith and courage. This pattern repeats throughout history. Warfare involves horrific methods that later generations prefer not to examine. Victories are celebrated, while the specific tactics that achieved those victories are quietly forgotten. Heroes are honored, while their most disturbing actions are erased from the record. History becomes mythology, becomes propaganda, becomes what we teach children in school. The Siege of Eger is a case study in historical erasure. We can trace exactly how the sanitization happened, because the timeline is relatively short, and the documentary record, though incomplete, is sufficient. Early sources contain disturbing details. Middle sources downplay those details. Late sources omit them entirely. By the 18th century, the siege is a fairy tale of Christian warriors defeating overwhelming Muslim hordes through faith, courage, and divine favor. But the early sources still exist. The fragmentary accounts survive in archives. The letters describing 7 types of fire and smoke that choked without natural source remain readable to anyone willing to look. The Ottoman medical reports describing unusual burn patterns and respiratory ailments are preserved in Istanbul collections. The Venetian intelligence referencing chemical arts is accessible to researchers. The full truth can be reconstructed. It requires accepting that the heroic narrative is incomplete, that the defenders use troubling methods, that warfare involves choices most societies prefer to forget. The civilians of Eger didn't want to become chemical weapon manufacturers. The soldiers didn't want to deploy toxic substances that violated their understanding of honorable combat. The commanders didn't want to face moral questions about methods that achieve victory at the cost of psychological trauma. But when you're facing extermination, when conventional tactics ensure defeat, when your children are starving behind fortress walls, you make choices you never imagined making. And then, if you survive, you spend the rest of your life trying to forget those choices, or justify them, or reframe them as something more acceptable. The historical profession has spent 5 centuries helping that reframing process, not through deliberate conspiracy, but through institutional preferences for inspiring narratives. national mythology construction, and collective discomfort with examining the darkest aspects of human behavior. But some historians push back. They ask inconvenient questions. They assemble fragmentary evidence. They propose interpretations that disturb comfortable narratives. They suggest that maybe, just maybe, we should acknowledge what actually happened rather than what we wish had happened. The Siege of Eger should be remembered accurately. The defenders were desperate people who survived through improvisation, creativity, moral compromise, and methods that horrified them. They won. But the victory was built on weapons that both sides later tried to pretend never existed. The smoke cleared, the bodies were buried, the survivors aged and died, and history replaced truth with legend. Except the truth never completely disappears. It hides in fragments, waiting in archives, preserved in letters nobody was supposed to read. It exists in gaps in the official record, in vague references that don't quite make sense, in contradictions between sources that reveal someone's lying. It persists in the psychological scars survivors described, in their confessions that mixing certain substances gave them nightmares, in their admission that victory came at a cost to their souls as well as their bodies. The truth waits, and occasionally someone finds it. If this investigation into forgotten history interested you, hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that history tried to erase. The fortress of Eger still stands. You can visit it today, walk the walls that defenders poured burning chemicals from, stand in the breaches where Ottoman soldiers choked on toxic smoke. Tourist information emphasizes the heroic defense, the courageous commander, the faith that sustained besieged Christians. There are plaques, monuments, museums. The siege is presented as a triumphant moment in Hungarian history, which it was. But triumph arrived through methods nobody commemorates. The survivors of 1552 knew what they'd done. They carried that knowledge until death. Some confessed it in letters never meant for publication. Some whispered it to family members who quietly buried the information. Some took it to graves unmarked, except by their own consciences. History remembers the victory. It forgets what it cost. And maybe that's how societies survive trauma. By forgetting the specific details of horror, by transforming reality into legend, by constructing narratives that inspire rather than disturb. Maybe the mythology serves a purpose, allowing descendants to take pride rather than grapple with moral ambiguity their ancestors faced. But something is lost in that process. The complexity, the humanity, the recognition that people in desperate circumstances make choices they never anticipated making. That survival sometimes requires methods that haunt survivors. That warfare involves moral compromise, psychological damage, and weapons both sides later prefer to deny existed. The Siege of Eger happened. The defenders won. The methods they used were disturbing. All three statements are historically accurate, and all three should be remembered together, not separated into comfortable and uncomfortable categories where only the comfortable part becomes official history. The smoke has cleared. The fires went out 5 centuries ago. The survivors have been dead for generations. But the truth, buried in fragmentary sources, sanitized in official chronicles, erased from patriotic narratives, that truth remains, waiting for anyone willing to acknowledge what actually happened on those walls. The defenders of Eger saved the fortress. And they paid for that salvation with nightmares that lasted the rest of their lives. Both things are true, both things matter, and both things should be remembered. History celebrates victories, but the cost of victory deserves acknowledgement too, even when that cost makes us uncomfortable, especially when that cost makes us uncomfortable, because the most important historical lessons come from facing what we'd rather forget.